The local Schwegmann's supermarket was the only arcade in town growing up, and I made sure to visit the 3 rotating arcade games there on grocery trips. Multiplayer was the name of the game back in the late 1980s, with Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles leading the charge, and for a while Ironman Stewart's Super Off Road represented such chaotic and fun multiplayer mayhem along the back wall of the grocery store. This was my first exposure to Super Off Road, a large, odd cabinet with 3 steering wheels spread across the control panel, the same setup the overhead F1 racing game Super Sprint had used 3 years earlier. Up to 3 players select a truck, red, yellow, and blue, and race around a variety of dirt tracks in a 3-lap race. The 3 players compete against each other and against Ironman Stewart in his invincible white Toyota truck. Well, they competed against him in the arcade game, as the 16-bit console ports omitted his license, now just called Super Off Road. The Ironman is a professional dirt racer with numerous victories to his name, but he's hardly a household name, and his removal from the game's title screen is not much of a loss here. The Genesis and SNES ports also lost a player, being stripped down a maximum of 2 human players in a 4-truck race. The loss of an extra player does hurt the game, particularly one with so little depth as Super Off Road, and given that it could have easily supported 4 players. It's a bare-bones port to a fault. Pick a name, buy power-ups, and race, rinse, and repeat. Though far from a perfect arcade port, the Genesis game holds up well. It's not as crisp or bright as the arcade or SNES ports, but the 64-color palette is able to include all of the detail of the 16 original arcade and expansion tracks. The courses are chock full of holes, puddles, bumps, and other natural obstacles to make driving difficult. While the course detail definitely does the job replicating the arcade, albeit with a dingier color scheme, it's inexcusable that such a game would not make full use of the display. Given that the game typically only tracks 4 very small active sprites at any given time, it's just bizarre that the Genesis would have to frame the screen in a black border, lessening the viewing of the action itself. Super Off Road does not come across as a game which taxes the Genesis hardware by any stretch of the imagination, and seeing a similar shrunken display as Capcom initially considered using for its Genesis port of the far more complex Street Fighter II just reeks of lazy programming. That's not entirely fair, though, as Tradewest did make some attempts to enhance the game for the Genesis. The exceedingly busty women featured prominently in the game aren't as simply colored and cartoon-looking like the arcade original, but now their proportions are even more unnatural and disturbing. They're now wearing a normal 2-piece bikini instead of the slutty Spender-style outfit the arcade women wore when posing with the top 3 racers, who have since grown mustaches for the Genesis port. Besides being one of the more memorable aspects of the arcade game for better or worse, I also point out the scantily clad women, as they are a Genesis exclusive, as Nintendo's strict parenting of its games at the time had them replaced with trucks or omitted altogether. With more color and detail than the arcade in these between race moments, it would be wrong to lament the lack of arcade perfection, as it appears Tradewest did its best to improve upon it, but at the same time, everything outside the race just looks odd due to the poor art direction. Fortunately, the racing looks great, with the trucks jittering over the tracks and jostling for position, trying to place in the top 3 to earn prize money. Money is used to upgrade the truck's tires, shocks, acceleration, and top speed at the start of each race. Nitro can be purchased as well as found along the track at times, each providing a short noticeable boost which can really help overcoming the terrain and gaining an edge. The problem is that the game is too nitro-driven, as no matter how often a truck gets upgraded, nitro stock is ultimately what determines the winner. Unfortunately for the human players, the ghost of Ironman Stewart driving the unmarked white truck is the king of nitro, and it's not uncommon for him to have several dozen nitros at hand compared to the handful most human players can afford. While nitros and money can be grabbed on the track at times when they appear, they're often in difficult-to-reach locations and not worth the extra effort to grab them. Thus, it's imperative that the player come in first, as first place's prize money of $150,000 affords the winner a lot more upgrade options than second place's $100,000 or third place's $50,000. After a few races, the game's quarter muncher roots begin to show, and no matter how well the player invests earned money, it will be impossible to compete the white truck of doom. With a bottomless well of nitros no doubt funded by the licensing fee Leland Corporation paid Stewart for use of his name, the white truck makes ludicrous gains in speed, handling, and nitro stock, even when the player repeatedly nabs the first-place spot. Without the money afforded by a first-place victory, it becomes difficult to keep placing each race, as a larger portion of the upgrade budget must be devoted to refilling the nitro stock at $10,000 a pop. Super Off Road is purely an arcade title, and the game offers no tournament or season setting to extend its console life. Thus, it gets old fast as a single-player experience a la Arch Rivals and other arcade hits with no depth. Super Off Road is of course more fun with a friend, but the overall sameness of the 16 single-screen dirt tracks doesn't help from keeping the game repetitive as cycles from race to race. While the tracks are unique in their design and variety of obstacles, the end result is still a bunch of trucks shaking and bopping for 4 laps over rough terrain regardless of the particular type of terrain. The huge water tracks of Pig Bog don't react much differently than the hills of Blaster, the bumps on Volcano Valley, and so forth. After the first loop the trucks race in the opposite direction, but that, too, isn't much to extend the home life of this arcade game. A generic rock soundtrack and sparse sound effects round out the faithful yet mediocre feeling the game exudes. The game wears thin quickly, and I suspect anyone playing it will begin to question where the fun went. The fun was left behind at Schwegmann's, bumping and pushing against 2 other strangers as we fought to stay in control of our trucks while wasting the competition. As a 2-player game, Super Off Road just feels all the more hollow, and it's a wonder why 4-player support was not included in this Genesis version as it was in the NES port. Simple left/right steering and 2-button control, accelerate and boost, make it a game anyone can pick up and enjoy. While sometimes obstacles or the track railing can obscure the player's truck, the vehicles themselves are pretty responsive aside from the odd spin out here or there. Ivan Ironman Stewart's Super Off Road was Leland Corporation's biggest hit before being absorbed into Trade West, and that was due to the fantastic multiplayer action, which was sadly forgotten while making the leap to the Genesis. Lackluster production and limited 2-player support leave Super Off Road a weak console representation of an arcade game which ultimately will be remembered as a flash in the pan itself. Every once in a while, there comes the sort of game that you can play through in 15 or 20 minutes. Super Off Road 2, The Baja is one such title. Like its immediate predecessor, the game is really quite short without a lot of variety to offer. However, unlike Super Off Road, the sequel wears short very quickly and is likely to leave you with a bitter taste in your mouth. In Super Off Road, the perspective was quite a bit different. There was a single screen that indicated the course you should race through, similar to Super Sprint or perhaps a compressed version of RC Pro-Am. Players would keep racing, collecting cash and nitro, upgrading their vehicles and moving on to the next race. When the game ran out of courses, it threw the same ones right back at the player with slight modifications. There was something quite appealing about the whole experience, even if it was simplistic. This time around, the game looks more like Super Mario Kart. The view is from behind the vehicle and the courses are wide open. Basically, they are a set of muddy roads leading off into the wild blue yonder, and the player is mostly just heading in a straight line. The only deviations necessary are those that lead around trees, cactus plants, animals, people, and people riding 4-wheelers throughout the area. As you race, you'll be bumped by the other racers, who will be doing their best to cause you to run over the 4-wheeler riders so that you lose your cash. Speaking of cash, it's one of the main reasons to keep playing. A first-place finish on a course leads to a $100,000 pot, except that if you've hit too many pedestrians along the way, you don't get quite the booty. Failing to reap such rewards will make your wallet too thin to upgrade the vehicle appropriately, which will lead to poor race performance in the next leg of a given race. Conversely, a first-rate finish with few collisions will make you wealthy and allow you to invest in the all-important nitro boosts. Once you have upgraded your vehicle to its maximum and have enough nitros to consistently place in first place, it can be fun to challenge yourself and see how much cash you have when the race is over. Of course, the race will be over quite quickly, regardless of how poorly you perform, or how well. There are basically 3 courses to play, with 4, 6, or 8 legs. Even the longest race, the Baja, is rather short compared to other Super Nintendo offerings from the period. However, the game's greatest weakness isn't necessarily its diminutive size. Rather, it's the aforementioned lack of variety. Half the races are so similar to one another that the sense of accomplishment when moving from one leg of a race to the next is severely diminished. About the most noticeable difference between segments is the skyline, which changes from morning to evening to nightfall. The effect is subtle, and really shouldn't serve as the highlight it is. Along the same lines, the visuals in general aren't all that great. The whole time you're racing, you'll be looking at a cheesy Mode 7 effect that may have looked great in Super Mario Kart but just doesn't do the job here. It's quite obvious that the system is straining hard to refresh frames at a rapid rate, and the effect certainly could be worse, but it still shows its age. As you race along, you'll see people standing in place, and animals here and there, but they all just look like cardboard signs that would blow over in a slight breeze. Then there are the trucks themselves. I didn't count the frames of animation, but it seems there are only about 7 or 8. They correspond roughly to the vehicle's elevation or to the direction it is turning, but the transition from one frame to the next is so choppy that all you have to do to steer is tap left or right a few times and you'll be perfectly lined up with the destination. At least the sound department fares better. There are only around 4 different songs in the game, but they have a fair amount of personality and do a good job reflecting the flavor of the atmosphere. The races all take place down in the Mexico area, and the Super Nintendo has perhaps never done a better job of pumping out tunes of that nature. Sound effects also are competently done. Nothing here sounds truly fantastic, but the idling engines are among the best on the system, and there are really satisfying sounds when nitro is used to launch a vehicle over a short hill and into the air. Hills and nitro are another thing I enjoy about the game. If you race long enough to build up a good supply of nitro, races can take on quite the frantic pace. You'll zip along the roads, weaving between plants, around four-wheelers, and through groups of other trucks. There are plenty of small hills and streams to rush over, so it's great fun to see how long you can zip along the rough terrain before hitting so many obstacles that your truck is ruined. If you're having too easy a time with the races, you can also adjust the difficulty. The default level is pretty nice, but the easier mode can also be enjoyable. The third difficulty level is quite a doozy, perhaps too hard for its own good. And of course, there are passwords to save your progress regardless of the difficulty level. Once you've played a few times, though, you won't even want to bother with them. They take forever to write down, and the game is simple enough that they're not really necessary. In the end, what Trade West brought us this time around is a series of short races that isn't memorable but for the fact that if you work hard enough, they're good for a bit of frantic fun. If that sounds like your thing, it might be worth a quick rental. Or maybe you'll find it in a bargain bin and make a purchase. Just make sure the price is right. Oh, and one other thing, this game does have a 2-player mode so you can race a friend. Just make sure you have a lot of friends. After all, there are better racers out there, both on the Super Nintendo and elsewhere. They'll probably want to play those instead. And more likely than not, so will you.